Confucius was one of the most celebrated thinkers in human history. He had a system for everything: how rulers should govern, how families should function, how people should treat each other. And it worked. Courts studied it. Emperors built governments on it. Millions of people organized their lives around his ideas for over 2,000 years. But 3 times in his life, he sat down with one old man, and each time he walked away shaken. Not because the old man argued with him. He didn't. He just asked questions. And somehow that was worse. That old man was Lao Tzu, and what he said in those 3 meetings didn't just challenge Confucius's system. It pointed to the exact place where every rigid system breaks. The same place yours is probably breaking right now. Confucius had a system that actually worked. To understand why those meetings hit Confucius so hard, you need to understand what he'd actually built, because it wasn't abstract philosophy. It was a working manual for navigating power in a chaotic world. Confucius lived during the Warring States period, which is exactly what it sounds like. A few hundred years of fragmented China, warlords competing for territory, social order collapsing in real time. Into that chaos, he walked in with a blueprint. He called it the correct ordering of relationships, 5 of them specifically: ruler to subject, parent to child, husband to wife, elder sibling to younger, and friend to friend. Each one came with defined roles, defined duties, defined behavior. You knew where you stood, you knew what was expected, and if everyone played their part correctly, the whole structure held. This wasn't soft idealism. It was strategic thinking about how power actually moves through a society. Confucius understood that most instability doesn't come from outside forces. It comes from people not knowing their role or refusing to honor it. His system gave them a map. He spent years traveling from court to court, trying to get rulers to adopt it. He was, in the language we'd use today, pitching his framework. Constantly, relentlessly. He genuinely believed that if the right people would just follow the right structure, things would stabilize. The effort to outcome logic was clean. Better inputs, better outputs, repeat. And here's what's worth sitting with. It wasn't wrong. His framework described real patterns in how human hierarchies function. Societies that maintain clear role structures do tend to be more stable. His diagnosis of the problem was accurate, but he kept running into the same wall. Rulers would listen, nod, and then ignore him. Courts would adopt pieces of his system and then abandon them when conditions changed. The chaos he was trying to solve kept winning. And the more that happened, the harder he pushed. More refinements to the moral code, more elaboration of the rituals, more courts to visit. That's the pattern that matters here. When a system stops producing results, the instinct of someone who built it is almost always to double down, add more structure, tighten the rules, enforce it harder. Confucius was doing exactly that, and he was smart enough to sense somewhere that he was running in place. So he went looking. That's the part that often gets left out of this story. He didn't stumble into Lao Tzu by accident. He sought him out. He had a system he believed in. He had evidence it wasn't working the way he expected, and he wanted answers. He wasn't ready for the ones he got. The 3 meetings, what Lao Tzu actually said. Quick note before we get into these meetings. Historians debate whether they actually happened. The accounts come from texts like the Shiji and the Zhuangzi, written centuries after both men lived. Scholars have argued about their authenticity for a long time, but here's what's not in dispute. These stories have shaped Taoist and Confucian tradition for 2,500 years. Whether they're literal history or constructed legend, they've been treated as true by millions of people across dozens of generations. So let's treat them as what they are, the most important conversations in Chinese philosophical history. The first meeting, Confucius came with a specific question. He wanted to talk about ritual and ceremony, the formal structures he'd built so much of his system around. He believed that ritual was the mechanism through which correct behavior became habit. Get the ritual right, and the values follow. So he asked Lao Tzu about it. Lao Tzu's response wasn't a counter-argument. It was more unsettling than that. He said, essentially, the men who created those rituals are dead and gone. Their bones are dust. All you have left is the shell of what they built, and you're treating the shell like it's the thing itself. Why are you spending your life polishing the bones of dead men? Confucius didn't have a clean answer, but he came back. The second meeting went deeper. This time Lao Tzu didn't wait for a question. He pushed first. He said a good merchant hides his wealth. You'd never know what he had just by looking at him. A truly wise person looks ordinary, even plain. Then he looked at Confucius and said, why do you walk around advertising your virtue? Why does everything about you announce that you are a moral man? That one landed differently. Because Confucius's entire project was built on the idea that visible virtue was the point. You performed the correct behavior so others could see it, learn from it, and replicate it. The ritual had to be public to be useful. Lao Tzu was saying that need for visibility, that need to be seen as the wise man, the moral authority, was exactly what was getting in the way. It's worth pausing on that for a second, because it's not a small critique. Lao Tzu wasn't saying Confucius was a fraud. He was saying the performance of virtue and the actual thing had gotten tangled up, and Confucius probably couldn't tell where one ended and the other began anymore. The third meeting, by most accounts, Confucius didn't say much. He listened, and then he left. What he said to his students afterward became one of the most quoted passages in all of classical Chinese writing. He told them, I know how birds fly. I know how fish swim. I know how animals run across the ground. For things that run, you can set a trap. For things that swim, you can cast a net. For things that fly, you can shoot them down with an arrow. But there is a creature that rides the wind and clouds and ascends into heaven. I have no idea how to catch that. That is Lao Tzu. Think about what that admission cost him. This was a man who had spent his entire life building a framework for understanding how the world worked. And he was telling his students there was something out there his framework couldn't touch. What Lao Tzu was doing across all three meetings wasn't attacking the system. He never said Confucius was wrong about rituals or relationships or moral codes. He just kept pointing to the edge, the place where the map ran out. Confucius's whole framework assumed the world was stable enough to be organized, that if you got the structure right, it would hold. Lao Tzu kept gesturing at everything the structure couldn't hold. And the thing that stung most wasn't the critique of the system, it was the deeper implication that needing a perfect system in the first place was itself a kind of fragility. The way of water, what it actually means. So what was Lao Tzu actually offering instead? Because if the critique was, your rigid system will break against reality, the natural question is, okay, so what do you do? The answer he gave is in the Tao Te Ching, and it keeps coming back to one image. Water, not because water is soft or peaceful or poetic. That's the misreading. Lao Tzu wasn't making a case for gentleness. He was making a case for what actually wins over time. Water is the most patient force in nature, and it has never lost a long fight. It doesn't attack the rock in front of it. It doesn't announce a strategy. It just finds the path around the rock, under it, through whatever crack exists, and it keeps moving. Give it enough time and the rock is gone. The water is still there. That's the operating principle. Not weakness, unstoppable persistence through complete flexibility. The concept he built around this is Wu Wei. It gets translated as do nothing, which has misled a lot of people into thinking Taoism is about passivity or withdrawal. It isn't. Wu Wei means don't force. More specifically, it means act in alignment with what the situation actually is. not what you need it to be, not what your framework says it should be, not what worked last time. What is it right now? This is the exact gap between the two systems. Confucius's approach required conditions to be stable enough that a structure could take hold. You need the ground to be still before you can build on it. Lao Tzu's approach starts from the opposite assumption. The ground is never still, so any structure you build rigid enough to feel permanent is already fragile. Wu Wei works precisely because things keep moving. You're not trying to stop the current, you're learning to read it. A concrete way to see this: think about two leaders facing the same organizational crisis. One has a strong process, a clear hierarchy, a system that's worked for years. When things start breaking down, the instinct is to enforce the process harder. Call more meetings, add more oversight, tighten the decision-making structure. The other leader drops into the actual situation, talks to the people closest to the problem, lets the response take the shape the moment requires, holds the goal fixed but loosens the method. Same destination, completely different relationship to the path. The first leader isn't stupid. The process probably was right in normal conditions, but the process became the thing being protected instead of the outcome it was built to serve. That's what Lao Tzu was pointing at in those meetings with Confucius. Not that rituals and relationships and moral codes are worthless, but that when you defend the system more fiercely than you read the actual situation in front of you, you've already lost. You're protecting the map while the territory shifts under your feet. And here's the part that tends to surprise people. This isn't a philosophy for beginners or for people who haven't built anything yet. It's most useful after you've spent decades constructing something real. Because that's when the attachment runs deepest. You built the system, you know it works, you have evidence, and so when it stops producing, the last thing you want to consider is that the system itself might be the problem. The question Lao Tzu kept pushing Confucius toward wasn't, is your system wrong? It was simpler and harder than that. Which parts of what you're carrying are still alive, and which parts are just habit? Water doesn't carry anything it doesn't need. That's not a poetic observation. It's the actual mechanism of how it gets through. Where Confucius's system breaks in modern life. Here's where this stops being ancient history. The Confucian trap isn't something that only happened to a philosopher in 500 BCE. It's the default setting for anyone who's spent serious time building something that works. You develop a framework for managing people, for making decisions, for running your career, and at some point the framework starts working well enough that you stop questioning it. That's not laziness. That's how competence is supposed to function. You build something, it works, you trust it. The problem comes at the next stage, which almost nobody talks about. The framework starts to calcify. It goes from being a tool you use to being a structure you live inside. And once that happens, the framework doesn't just describe how you operate. It becomes who you are. Your identity gets load-bearing. So when conditions change and the framework stops producing the same results, it doesn't feel like a strategy problem. It feels like a personal attack. Watch what happens in organizations when this plays out. A team hits a wall, new competition, a market that's moved, a relationship that's broken down. The leader who built the team's process has two options. The first is to look at the actual situation and ask what it's asking for. The second is to conclude the system just needs better enforcement, more discipline, cleaner execution of the existing rules. Almost every experienced leader picks the second option first, not because they're wrong to trust their system, it worked for a long time, but because the alternative means admitting the system might not be the answer right now. And that's a much harder thing to sit with when you spent years building it. This is exactly what Confucius kept doing. More courts, more refinements. The moral code got more elaborate, the rituals more specific. The system kept expanding to cover the gaps where reality kept escaping. He wasn't failing because he lacked intelligence or commitment. He was failing because he was applying the right tool to conditions it wasn't built for, and he couldn't see that clearly because the tool had become him. There's a specific point where this tends to surface for people who've been operating at a high level for a long time. The strategies that drove real results in their 30s and 40s start losing their edge. The effort they're putting in stays the same or increases, but the return quietly drops, and the gap is confusing because nothing has obviously gone wrong. No single failure, no clear turning point. Just a slow, frustrating mismatch between how hard you're working and what you're actually getting back. Lao Tzu's read on that situation isn't that you've lost your ability or your edge. It's that you're applying real competence to conditions that have shifted while insisting the conditions haven't. You're doing the right things, you're just doing them in a room where the walls have moved and you haven't looked up yet. The question he'd push you toward is a simple one, and a genuinely uncomfortable one. What are you protecting right now that's no longer protecting you back? Because that's the real function of a rigid system. At this stage, it stops being a tool for navigating the world and starts being a way of not having to feel how much the world has changed. Structure becomes shelter, and the harder you push on it, the more energy goes into maintaining the shelter, and the less goes into actually moving. There's a line people sometimes use when they don't want to change course. I just need to execute better. It sounds like discipline, it sounds like accountability, but a lot of the time it's a way of refusing to ask whether the direction itself needs adjusting. Confucius said that to himself in different words for years. He kept executing better. The chaos kept winning. The difference between holding a position and holding a direction is real, and it matters. You can stay completely committed to where you're going while being completely flexible about how you get there. That's not weakness. That's actually what the strongest systems eventually learn to do, or they break. The practice, reading the current. So what does this actually look like in practice? Because be like water is easy to say and hard to use. The shift isn't about adopting a new philosophy, it's perceptual. You're training yourself to read what's actually in front of you instead of what your system predicts should be there. Those are two different inputs, and most experienced people have spent so long trusting the second one that they've stopped noticing the gap. When you hit resistance, real resistance, the kind where effort stops translating into movement, there are three questions worth sitting with before you add more force. First, is this situation asking for pressure, or is it asking for space? Second, what am I protecting here that I don't actually need to protect anymore? Third, and this is the one that tends to cut deepest, what would I do if I weren't trying to prove the system still works? That last one is the Lao Tzu question. He never told Confucius to abandon his values or burn down everything he'd built. He just kept asking him to look at what was actually in front of him, separate from what he needed to see. That's a harder skill than building the system was. Building it required intelligence and discipline. Reading past it requires something closer to honesty. Here's what actually happened to Confucius after those meetings, at least according to the tradition. He didn't become a Taoist. He didn't discard the rituals or the relationships or the moral codes, but something in how he carried them changed. The performance quieted down. He stopped needing every court to validate the framework. He taught more and pitched less announcement of virtue, more actual presence with his students. The system became a set of real tools again instead of an identity he was defending. That's the practical version. Your experience is real. Your systems were built on real patterns. The question is whether you're using them to navigate the current situation or using them to avoid feeling how much the situation has changed. One of those is strength. The other one just looks like it. The hardest part of The Way of Water has nothing to do with philosophy. It's the pause before you respond, sitting still long enough to feel which direction things are actually moving, not which direction you're pushing, not which direction the map says. before you decide what to do next. That pause is where the reading happens. Most people skip it. Water never does. Lao Tzu didn't beat Confucius's system by building a better one. He showed that clinging to any system, even a good one, is what makes you brittle when conditions shift. If that question is sitting with you, subscribe. There's more where this came from.